All right. We good? Okay. Child SSI cases. We've talked about this before. We have not done a full episode on it. So first, I'll kind of give an introduction to people that don't know the difference between SSDI and SSI. Briefly, we talk about this all the time, so I'll make it brief. But the two main disability programs that we handle that both go through Social Security, SSDI and SSI, you have to be medically disabled for both of them. There's no difference there. The technical eligibility is different. For SSDI, it's based on you work and then you pay into FICA taxes. That's how you are eligible for SSDI,
Right.
Paying in enough for a certain amount of time. SSI has nothing to do with your work history. Even if you've never worked, you could still potentially qualify for SSI. Instead of looking at your tax contributions, they look at your financial situation, what your income and resources are. But you got to be medically disabled either way. A lot of people don't realize that children could be eligible for a program.
For both titles, actually.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Let's talk about that. Then that's pretty much a good place to start, and then I'll let you jump into it.
Sure. The vast majority of childhood cases are going to be SSI cases, needs-based. Obviously, there's never going to be earnings on a childhood. Well, there will rarely be earnings on a childhood case. I guess if you're a 16-year-old, you are still technically under Social Security rules a child, and you guys, I guess if you worked a part-time summer job,
like a grocery store or something.
Earnings.
Yeah, sure.
But SSI would still be the same kinds of needs-based criteria. They have an income limit. They have a resource limit. On Title II childhood cases, these cases are where the child is filing on their disabled parent, their deceased parent, or their retired parent. You don't see retired parent very often because you'd have to have children really late in life to be getting retirement benefits and having somebody that's under the age of 18. But it happens. Most of the time, it's either the parent is deceased or they're disabled, and the child can draw off of that account. And there's the income and resource limits don't apply because it's Title II SSDI benefits. So the vast, though, majority of cases that we see in childhood cases are going to be SSI.
Okay. And assuming it's a child that's like 8 years old, they're not going to look at the child's income and resources because an 8-year-old probably doesn't have a bank account.
Right.
So they look at the parent's income and resources.
And they deem it, and it's called deeming.
Mm-hmm.
And when they deem that income, it's actually pretty fair. A lot of times, like in a spouse-to-spouse deeming, if you're applying for disability and your spouse is already on disability, they're getting unearned income, they're going to count every dollar of that. If you're trying to get disability and your spouse has VA benefits or a pension, they're going to count that. The only time they don't count at all is when your spouse is working, and then they count half their income. But for children, it's so complicated that I'm not even going to attempt to explain it, other than the fact that it's a lot more or a lot less restrictive when a parent's income or resources are deemed to the child. Social Security will do that, and it's actually a pretty complicated formula that they use.
Well, because it's not just income and resources; it's also how many total kids are in the household.
Is one of the kids on disability? That changes things. Yeah. So there's just a lot of factors that there's just no way that we could cover, and I don't think people would find it interesting or helpful when the Social Security Administration is going to take care of all that when you apply.
Yeah. If a client comes to us, I would recommend if your child is medically disabled and you're unsure about the technical stuff, like the income and resources, just go ahead and file, or go ahead and just schedule a call with us, and because I can use the formula and I can go to the SSA's website and figure it out in real time.
Right.
So don't worry about that yourself. Just schedule a call with us, or just apply through Social Security's website, and they'll help you out. Okay, so the application process for an SSI child case, pretty much the same.
It is the same. On the computer, it's a little bit different. Looks different because it's usually an SSI only application. A lot of the questions that you'll find on a regular disability application wouldn't apply. You know, they
Yeah.
want to know about, you know, your spouse, your dependent children. When's the last time you worked? You know, what kind of work were you doing? That's on a regular application. On an SSI application, especially for a child, you know, they're not in, you know, they don't need all that information. They are going to ask, though, the pertinent. Why are they disabled? Who are their providers that will, you know, provide medical records? And the biggie, what school are they going to, and what's their main teacher's name? And when you ask me about that later, which I'm sure you will, about, you know, criteria, I will explain why that is of paramount importance in a childhood case. But as far as the application process goes, that's about what it is. It's, you know, it's online again, because it's, you know, 90% of the time an SSI case, they are going to call. They have to do an interview, an SSI interview. Sometimes we schedule that. We certainly try to schedule that, even though we've probably already done the online part. They'll pull it. The Social Security Administration will pull it up, and then they'll ask the questions they need to ask, which are usually resource questions. You know, how many cars do you have? How many properties do you own? How many other kids are in the household? What are their ages? Are any of them disabled? You know, et cetera, et cetera. So that's pretty much the same as any kind of SSI application. It's just the questions that are more appropriate are going to be in regard to school.
Okay, yeah. So pretty much the same process as far as filing the case. And then I already know the answer to this, but just to confirm, the wait time is the exact same, right?
No difference.
And the stages, so you apply, if you're denied, you appeal it. If you're denied a second time, you go in front of a judge, either in person or likely over the phone.
Yep.
Same thing, right?
Same
No difference
thing.
there.
Yeah, the only difference in a hearing is, you know, in a regular Social Security case, the claimant is the star witness. In a childhood case, the custodial parent, or the parent, usually the mom, that has the most knowledge of the child's day-to-day activities will be the star witness. Some judges do want to talk to the child, especially if the child are in their teens, you know, 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. They could have a conversation with them. Had a childhood case last week, and the judge did ask if I wanted the 14-year-old child to testify, and the mother had given great testimony, and everything was in order. There was no need for it. But sometimes the judges have that option. They, you know, if they want it, I always have my clients, which is usually the mom. I always have them have the child there. You know, even if it means taking them out of school for a day. We're having our hearing. They're going to call you at such and such time. You know, have your daughter or your son, you know, ready to talk, and then I'll prep them just like I prep the mom. You know, hey, you know, it's little Susie, you know, I'm going to ask you some questions next week, and I'll give her the questions I'm going to ask, and I'll ask her how you would answer that, and to see if the child is really, you know, able to do, you know, a question and answer type of interaction. And if they're not, the last thing I want is to wig them out. You know, it's like,
Yeah, you don't want to stress them out over it.
There's a judge on the line, and the judge is going to ask you some questions, and they're just wilting like a flower, you know. And smaller children, I think smaller children a lot of times are better witnesses. But I'll tell the mom and I'll tell the child, these are the type of questions I think the judge is going to ask, and I'm usually right. But so yeah, that's the only thing that's really different in the hearing is the custodial parent is the one who does most of the testifying.
Okay, cool. So that's the process, the technical process. And then the main question that the mom or dad of this child is going to be asking after they figure out, oh, wow, there's actually a chance that my son or daughter is eligible for SSI, the question they're going to ask is, do they qualify because of this condition? They're going to say, oh, well, you know, my daughter has ADHD or my son has a social anxiety disorder. Does that qualify him? And so, you know, it can be a physical or mental health impairment for a child, but I would assume the vast majority are some kind of mental health.
Vast majority.
But what am I looking for? Behavioral, I guess?
Yeah, ADHD, which is an anxiety disorder, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. We see that a lot. But they have a lot of, a lot of conditions that also impact the child. Childhood asthma is a big one that we see. So there are some physical ones, but learning disability, speech disorder, ADHD, OCD, those are the ones that we see the most of.
Yeah, I signed a child client, a couple weeks ago or a month ago, and yeah, they had asthma with a daily rescue inhaler, but they were also doing nebulizer treatments, and that's the first time I've ever heard of a child
Yeah.
doing nebulizer treatments like multiple times a day. It's like that's tough. That would definitely get in the way of things such as school and then later on in life work.
Right.
Okay. Well, I'm trying to think. I mean, I guess just list out, if you can list out the most common ones. And we talked about this like 1 or 2 episodes ago, but the most common conditions that you see in SSI child cases or any kind of child cases. Kind of just went over it, but
definitely ADHD, anxiety disorders. They call them behavioral disorders if they're acting out in school. Those could qualify under like the affective disorders, depression, things like that. OCD, we don't see a lot of psychosis. Not a whole lot of that. Learning disability, that's a huge one. Learning disability and ADHD are probably, battling for the 1 and 2 spot in what we see. And you're right, we don't see a lot of physical maladies. Not that, kids don't have them. The thing is that the resources and the medical community are pretty good about dealing with those to give them fairly normal functionality, but not in a mental health. We don't find that at all. I mean, it's like, can you do psychotherapy on a 6-year-old? Well, good luck.
yeah,
I mean, you can try. Usually, what they do is they pump them full of medication, and of course, I'm not going to say that the cure is worse than the disease, but a lot of these medications just they have some pretty significant side effects, like a lot of the medications for ADHD, they calm you down, but they also have some problems with impeding your growth. So
yeah,
I mean, there's some pretty significant side effects. But yeah, I'd say ADHD and learning disorder top the list of that. The things that we look for, jumping the gun, I'll just go ahead and answer the question you're going to ask. In these kinds of cases, what we're going to see is problems in school. If they're not school age, our work is cut out for us. It's going to be nearly impossible to prove that the child has disabling impairments, because all we have to go on is mom or dad's description of things. We don't have, and maybe a doctor's pediatrician or pediatric practice, maybe even a pediatric psychiatric practice. They're out there. But Social Security, and this is going back to what I said earlier, Social Security puts a premium on what the school officials see.
Mm-hmm.
If they're in 2nd grade, even in 2nd grade, these small children are with other adults for hours upon hours upon hours a week. And these other adults, they got no skin in the game. So they're not like mom or dad. Mom and dad needs the benefits. And so, Social Security, especially judges, are, they're going to kind of look at them, is what you're telling me, is it really that bad? Do the medical records show that it's really that bad? Do the school records show that it's really that bad? So if you have a child who at home is, acting out, throwing temper tantrums, smacking their head against the wall, lying on the floor, beating the floor with their fists, and then they show up to school and they're an A and B student, I'm going to have a real hard time proving to Social Security that this child has horrible behavioral issues. Because what we normally would see is if all that's going on at home, they're having horrible times. The parents are usually in talking to the teacher or the principal weekly. And if we don't see that, it's really hard to prove that. Teachers are, without any kind of doubt at all, the best source of information. And there's this document called the Teacher ADL, which Social Security will send. We'll send them if it gets to the hearing level, and Social Security hasn't gotten them, but they'll always send them. And the Teacher ADL, the Teacher Activities of Daily Living form, it basically just asks, does this child have difficulties in this area? And there are 6 areas, childhood areas. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they're the areas that you would think, acquiring information, using information, getting along with others, communicating with others, taking care of themselves. Can this 12-year-old tie his shoes? Things like that. And the teachers see all this stuff, and they can fill out this form. If the medical records give me a diagnosis, which that's usually all I'm going to get from childhood medical record, I'm going to get a diagnosis. Mom and Dad have filled out the ADL form. He's like this at home, and he's just a tiger that's out of control. And then I get a Teacher ADL that says, he's horrible in school. He picks on other children, or he doesn't get along with other children. I've got a great case because everything is lining up.
Consistent.
And it's all saying the same thing.
Yep.
So the Teacher ADL, Teacher Activities of Daily Living form, they're great. We usually want to get 2, especially if they're in a setting to where they're seeing several teachers, the 2 that see them the most and that know the most. And if you're wondering about why things take really, really long if you apply at the beginning of the year, because right when you get everything rolling in your case, summer vacation.
Yeah.
They're out of school. And Social Security's, we got to get that Teacher ADL. Okay, well, the teacher's off until August or September, so we're not going to get that in June and July and early August. So that adds a delay. So that there's always that. Same thing around Christmas time. There's usually about a month, where they're off for Christmas holidays. If they're off, we can't get, especially the school records. It's just really, really hard to get anything from the school when they're not there.
Right. So
we do have a struggle with that. But I like childhood cases. We've talked about this before. In an adult case, I live in the gray. And, when I train my people who come on board, that is basically one of the things I always tell them. We make our living in the gray. And what I mean by that is that they're not really black and white in most of our cases. Sometimes there are. We've talked about, cancers that metastasize, that spread to some other area. That's meets the listing. Those are black and white. But, okay, well, this person's, they're 48 years old, and, they're having a hard time lifting more than 20 pounds, and their past work was this, and you have to add all of this very complicated information. You have to build it all together and see, is this something that would preclude you from working full time? If it is, I will make an argument, and I'll cite evidence, but I can't cite evidence in a black and white way that I would for somebody with, a terminal disease that's just right there in the medical records. However, in a childhood case, there are only 3 ways that a childhood case can be won. They meet the listing, which means black and white, big time. Childhood cancer, they have ADHD, and they're, 3 grades behind their peers. Teachers are having problems just keeping them doing basic school responsibilities, school tasks. Black and white, or they equal the listing. Not all the I's are dotted and not all the T's are crossed in a meets the listing kind of way, but they equal the listing, which is still black and white. It's just that Social Security Administration takes a little bit or gives a little bit more liberty in what you have to prove. And then there's the third way, and that's the vast, vast, vast majority of cases, and it is functionally equaling a listing. So if you're going to functionally equal, let's say the ADHD or learning disability listings, you're not going to dot every I, you're not going to cross every T, you're not going to go down that black and white list, but it's still black and white because you have to have at least 2 areas of those 6 areas we talked about earlier. 2 of them have to be markedly limited, and you normally get that from the teacher ADL. If they have 2 or more of those 6 areas that are markedly limited, then they functionally equal a listing.
Can you give an example of that real quick? Say a client has ADHD. What would be 2 of those criteria that they have to hit?
Number 1 and number 2, they're acquiring and using information, and then getting along with others.
Okay. And that's proved just using the medical records and then predominantly the teacher's information.
Yeah, a lot of times what the pediatric records will show, even if they're not psychiatric records for somebody with a mental impairment, which, like I said, that's the vast majority of our childhood cases. But the medical records will show, little Johnny came in and he doesn't make eye contact. But I did, I gave him a train to play with while I was doing my examination, and you get kind of a flavor of what his functional level is. Okay, he's in 7th grade age-wise, but he's reading at the 2nd grade level or less. He has no friends in 7th grade. All of his friends are really, really young, or he doesn't have any friends at all. He plays with his 3-year-old brother's toys. He's in 7th grade. Those kinds of things, and you'll see that in the medical records. But the main thing that we'll be able to use is from the teacher ADLs, the school records.
Right.
They'll do an IEP, which is a kind of a functional, where is this child academically? Those are in all public school records. I think most private schools too, but definitely public school records. They do those periodically, and that'll also tell you. Report cards, believe it or not, are pretty helpful in a disability case for childhood.
Right. If one of the claims is that they have trouble concentrating, but then they're a straight A student, it's pretty hard to believe right?
Yeah, that's going to be hard to sell. But yeah, if they're, since report cards not only give you the grade, they also will say, he's having a hard time, completing assignments, or they're consistently late, or there are consistent sloppy mistakes. And they never get better. Those things pop up in everybody's records from time to time. That's part of growing up. But that's not what you would see in a disabled child's record. You would see it consistently. It doesn't get better. It just they're just kind of out there.
Yeah.
So school records will show that. But the first 2 of the 6 areas of disability, they get more physical as it goes along, but the first 2, acquiring and using information, and then communicating, acting appropriately with others, those are the big ones that we see. And if they're markedly limited in those 2, which is the main ones, especially from a psychiatric standpoint, I'll make a pretty solid argument that this child functionally equals the ADHD listing, or functionally equals the intellectual deficit listing. This person equals the depression listing, affective disorder listing.
Okay, yeah. Well, you answered a lot of the questions that I was going to ask. I was going to ask about whether there's some kind of variation of the MSS, the medical source statement, because for regular adult cases, like we've talked about a bunch of times on the podcast, one of the best pieces of information or best pieces of evidence that you can use to prove disability is actually getting a statement from their doctor. Absolutely. Or even a narrative letter. And I was going to ask if there any kind of variation for childhood cases, and that's essentially what you're talking about with a teacher ADL, right?
Right. And that's the way we look at it. Not all firms, I doubt all firms look at it the same way, but I equate a teacher ADL to a medical source statement. And that's not to say that we don't send medical source statements out. We do. We'll send them out, and they're a lot different. They basically mirror Social Security's 6 areas of function. But it's the teachers who know that stuff, really.
Okay.
You know.
Well, let me give you a couple scenarios for childhood SSI cases, and you can tell me what you think. And probably the answer to all of them is going to be that it depends, because I'm not going to give you
I hate that answer.
a whole lot of information here. But because I get a lot of these, and I'm not entirely sure how to deal with them. A big one that I see is the child actually doesn't have any kind of medical treatment at all, and maybe they've never had any kind of medical treatment for their conditions. Like, let's say it's ADHD and autism. I'll go into that because I'm going to use a real example of someone I spoke to, but they haven't actually seen a therapist or a pediatrician since they were born. They don't have any kind of counselor, and they haven't actually been confirmed tested for autism. It's suspected autism from the school. So their only evidence we would have is from the school.
Yeah, that's,
Teachers.
You know, I wish that scenario was something that I don't see all the time, but I do see it all the time. That's very common. Once again, though, you're asking, you're essentially asking Social Security, hey, you got to trust me. This is what my kid has. Usually with, you know, a diagnosis of autism, they're going to do testing, especially public schools, and they're going to find out where they are on the spectrum. Is it Asperger's? Is it just a pure, autistic disorder? And if it is an autistic disorder, what are their areas that are, depressed? Because that's really the interesting and sad part of autism. They can be really high functioning in some area. Like they could do a Rubik's Cube,
Yep.
and couldn't tie their shoes. There's that much of a swing in difference. It doesn't make any sense, except that's just kind of the way that they're wired. But we'd be looking for school records, and if a client or a potential client came to us and said, they have suspected it, but we don't have any treatment, you basically need to beg, the school system, hey, do some testing, and let's see where he's at. That's what I would suggest in that case. I don't think I'd take the case. I wouldn't have anything that really I could prove things with. Having said that, though, if they did have the diagnosis, let's say a really early diagnosis, like from second or third grade, he or she, they're on the spectrum, or they have a learning disorder, and maybe they've even done a WISC, the childhood IQ testing, and it's low, so they have a documented learning disorder, and they get that in the third grade, and the parents come and they're like, we want to apply for disability, and he's in ninth grade. Okay, has he had any testing done since then? No, not really. He's making D's in school, but they're passing him. They're moving him along. We did have to hold him back, 2 years, but it wasn't consecutive years. It was, sixth grade and fourth grade. So, you're working all this kind of stuff out, and then it should dawn on any representative: what is the treatment for a learning disorder? Mm-hmm. What is the treatment for somebody with autism? There's not a whole lot of treatment that you see in these cases. They basically get a diagnosis, and then there were some programs that they would usually be assigned to try to get them to where by the time they're an adult, they can have some kind of vocational future. They can land a job somewhere. That's going to be the extent of their treatment, because they're really, if my IQ is 71 and you tested me, in the third grade for that, my IQ is going to be 71 when I'm 17. And anything that you would have done in between, third grade and 11th grade, it's all going to be just kind of a program. You're always going to be behind. You're going to be in special ed. Those school records absolutely help us in cases of learning disorder and autism, stuff like that. But I always, wonder what exactly Social Security wants as far as treatment records in cases where there is no treatment. I mean, there are programs, but that's not really treatment. They're not going to go to a doctor, every 6 months, for their 71 IQ. They're not going to go to a doctor every 3 or 4 months with their autism diagnosis. They're going to identify it. They're going to try to put some programs in place in school, again, to get them as vocationally prepared as they possibly can. But that's going to be the extent of it. So I kind of bristle when Social Security, I hadn't had any treatment for this condition. What is it? Tell me what it is.
Yeah, what is this treatment you're talking about?
What is this magical treatment that they're going to have? What drug are they going to take, for their autism to disappear or their 71 IQ to jump up to 95? Let me know what that is.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah, so essentially, we're going to see less frequent treatment for those type of cases, but we still need a diagnosis
Right.
at the end of the day.
That's the thing. Like I said, not being hard, but, no treatment, no diagnosis, other than the school at one point saying we think that they're probably autistic. I'd be, as a parent, I'd be like, okay, well, if you think they are, you need to do the testing. Yeah. It's a public school, and that's a lot of what tax dollars go for, especially for special districts and stuff like that. So, but as a representative, I very, very unlikely that I would take that case. I just couldn't prove disability with it.
Yeah, and frankly, I think it's actually pretty common for parents to kind of self-diagnose their kids with things like ADHD, like they have trouble concentrating, therefore they're ADHD.
Yeah.
And that might be the case, but you can't just tell Social Security that, like, hey, where'd you get your diagnosis? Well, I just noticed that they're having trouble concentrating.
Yeah,
so.
And that happens in the hearings sometimes, that the parent will say, well, I can't get him to clean his room. Every parent that's ever lived on the earth from the beginning until now has had a child that they can't get to clean their room. That's
We're going to need more than that.
Yeah, we're going to need a lot more than that. Yeah,
Okay.
I can't get him to do his homework. Yeah, welcome to parenthood.
Okay. Another scenario. I've heard this one a couple of times, and I don't really know what to say to it. Because you've mentioned, if the child has been held back in school, they're 2 or 3 years behind in school, that's pretty solid evidence of what's going on. I've had cases where I'm talking to the parent, and they say their child is behind in school, and I ask them, have they been held back at all? And they say, well, no, they're doing the whole no kid left behind thing. So they're on, they're not on an 8th grade level, but yeah, they're in 8th grade. I don't really know how to look at that. Is it just a matter of special ed and what what level they're at, and not necessarily what grade they're actually at?
Exactly. It would be that IEP, that the educational plan that they, individual educational plan that they put forward, and they do them pretty frequently. I think every 2 or 3 years they do them, and so you would get an idea of how behind they are. But you got to think how obvious that should be in school records, that we're having to teach this class of 30 kids down to the lowest common denominator, and he's 2 or 3 years behind everybody else. That wouldn't happen for very long. That child would be taken out and be put in a special ed or a different class where other people who are struggling would be also. But that is, you brought up, you stole my thunder. Like, that's what we look at, in a kind of from a 5,000-foot view of a case, a childhood case. Are they behind their peers? And if they are, because a lot of times, normal kids are behind their peers. It happens. But if they're consistently 2 years behind their peers, this could be school. They should be reading at the 4th grade level, but they're reading at the 2nd grade level. They should be, doing things 4th graders do, but they're still doing things that 1st and 2nd graders do. Those are pretty solid indications that they're disabled, and and we'll definitely. That would be a likely case that I'd take.
Okay. Well, that's everything I had to ask. For the parents listening, do you have any other pointers or any other tips or anything you want to talk about?
Yeah, the big one, I kind of alluded to it before. If your child's in public education, you know, there are programs that are specifically your right to take advantage of. And testing is one of those things. If you think your child is far behind, the last thing you want is that no child left behind kind of philosophy. You don't want them, shoving your child into the third grade when they're reading at the first grade level, or worse. They're shoving them into the fifth grade and they're reading at the first grade level. They can't do basic math. They're in sixth grade. Do you really want your child? You want them to get through school and you want to get that diploma, and then they get fired the first week at McDonald's because they can't make change for somebody? Because that's what would happen.
Yeah.
So my advice would be, you got to, you want to be cordial. You always want to kill people with kindness. But demand testing. If you think your child is having some problems with ADHD, or they're having some problems with autism, and anything that you might think that, it's gone on for a while, and, there could be something here, and they're doing horribly in school, it's not enough to, talk to the teacher about, we need to straighten, I'm going to take all of his video games away. He'll start doing his homework, and you take all his video games away, and he's not doing his homework, and he's not doing this, and there's something off. You know that there's something off. Ask the school to test. And if they drag their heels, demand the school test.
Yeah.
Because that's, at the end of the day, that's, especially public schools, that's their job. I mean, they're there to educate children, and not just children who are, performing fine. They're there to educate people who are behind also. And if there's some kind of organic reason that they're behind, they have autism, or they have a learning disorder, or an expressive disorder, they hear something wrong, and that happens. We see that a lot. Terrible communication problem. They don't look people in the eye. They, when they're small, you think they're shy, and then when they're 12, you're realizing that they don't interact with people. Get them tested. Ask the school, again, nicely ask the school to test them, and if it doesn't happen, demand it. Hey, I've been asking you guys nicely. Now I'm demanding that you test my child. I think there's something going on.
Cool. All right. Well, that's a good place to end it.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a question about your disability case, drop it in the comment section below, and we will do our best to answer it in the next episode.